What's up, everybody, and welcome to the 10th podcast. And actually, that's a good number. We've got 10 of these underway. And I have one of my friends from back home. Say hi, Jean.
Hi.
I'm excited because I haven't talked about really Judeo-Christian values with many people. And it's always a fun discussion every time I've had it. And I'm looking forward to seeing Jean's perspective on all these things. So I guess
Stress 99. I'm sorry if I offend anyone. I don't know what's going on.
Good. Well, freedom of speech, everyone has a right to their opinion. Doesn't mean you have to like it or listen to it, actually. That's one interesting corollary everyone forgets. Freedom of speech is also the freedom to listen. You can ignore anyone you want.
Oh, but it's so hard. It's so hard, though.
See, it'll be fine. It's okay. All the hate will be on me. Don't worry. So I guess we should start. What would you say your religious background is? How would you identify as?
Okay, well, I grew up as agnostic because my mother was agnostic. She really wanted to not force any religion on me whatsoever. So I started exploring religion very recently, and I just started reading the Bible. So I guess if you're going with my religious, what I identify as, I guess the closest thing would be Christian. I don't know if I consider myself worthy enough to be called a Christian because I don't think I embody Jesus' teachings as well as I possibly could. But I guess you could call me a Christian that believes in the laws of the Torah still, which I think is pretty unusual in terms of Christian denominations.
Well, technically it should be all of them because, the 10 Commandments are one of the most essential
Oh,
laws.
yes, absolutely. I mean, I think pretty much all Christians celebrate the 10 Commandments. Well, except the Sabbath days. Sabbath days tend to be a little iffy on that one.
Well, don't most Christians do it on Sunday instead of Saturday?
Yeah, they mostly do it on Sunday. There was also some emphasis in the teachings, I think it was Paul, who said that, some people consider Sundays holy days, some people do it Saturdays, the Sabbath. Some people say that, 7 days of the week we should glorify God in that way. So it's there's also some different practices of what Sabbath days actually are. A lot of people just go to church and say, okay, I went to church and I did my worship, that will be my Sabbath day. Some other people do volunteer work. I think the main idea is to just do something special that day. I'm not even sure about how Sabbath days work myself. I honestly just take rest on Sabbath days. I guess my Sabbath days would be closer to the Jewish interpretation now that I think about it.
That's what I would say. I think the Jewish interpretation is meant so that you have one day of the week where you rest from work so that you can spend that day honoring the Lord and with your family. That's what the day I see it as meant for. And whenever any of the Jewish speakers that I've listened to, that's what they describe it as well.
That's I think pretty agreeable Sabbath day to me. But everyone celebrates the Sabbath day in a different way, and there's nothing wrong with that.
I think I forget the rabbi that said this quote, but it's not that the Jews kept the Sabbath; it's that the Sabbath kept the Jews. Fair, right?
I like that quote.
I find your background kind of interesting because it's very similar to mine. Well, when I was little, very little, I remember about 2 or 3. My parents used to take me with them to church, and it was an evangelical church, Latino church, lots of music. Latino churches always have lots of music. And my dad, he was a bass player. That was the main reason why we would go. And I remember very little. I remember more so the music and the people, but any of the ideas, no, those never really stuck with me. And then a little bit later, it would be more so after we stopped going, because we stopped soon after that, mainly because my dad got too busy at work, because he transitioned to a job with a lot more responsibilities, and then we never made the time to go in. So I stopped getting influence from that very early on.
Mm.
I remember my mom gave me I think it's called My First Bible, which is the biblical stories, but like all cartoony and stuff. I remember reading them, and I guess not thinking I remember two things vividly from it. I remember Joseph with his coat of many colors, and
Hmm.
then I remember the frogs because the way they drew it, it's like the plagues looked very, even though it was cartoony, like it looked kind of unbearable. Even as a little kid, you're like, I wouldn't want to do anything which let that happen to me.
Yeah.
And then after that, well, because my mom didn't really tell too much. She just more so kind of said put faith in God. But you don't really, I don't think you're born understanding what any of that is.
No.
I think it does need to be taught. So I remember something when things got tough. I would pray a lot when I was little. And then eventually I just kind of lost faith in that idea. What I kind of came to is that why would you put your faith in something else that you have no idea if has any control or is out there when sometimes the only person you can rely on is yourself. If you don't have the capacity to handle the problems of the world on your own, and you're always looking to something else to give you that strength, I guess I rationalize that you're never going to have that strength in the first place. So I kind of, that was early on. I was like in second grade, first grade when I came to that kind of conclusion. So I stopped really believing in back then. And that lasted a long time, only until recently, actually. Because for the most part, I was fine. And the reason why my morals are kind of very similar to what I would say, or developed very similar to, I want to say Judeo-Christian morals, is after that I kind of tried really hard to think what type of person would I have to be someone everyone can rely on, like a pillar of strength that's that can hold on tight no matter what what troubles came my way. And I worked on that a while, and I guess I understood good and evil in a lot of ways. I hated the idea of people suffering. Especially I hated the most someone choosing to make someone else suffer. That's why I don't
Mm.
like entitled people. I really don't like entitled people. I think one of the biggest roots to evil happening is people thinking they're above others.
Yeah.
Because if you're above them, then anything you do to them is excused. Like they're below you, so what does it matter?
Hmm.
But then I got hit with something that kind of rocked all of that. And then I had to really question why those morals were important. What's the reason for all those things that I believed? And I did a lot of reading, and I came to the conclusion that the only reason why good and evil do exist is if there's a moral law, like a universal moral law that's out there, eternal.
Hmm.
And the only way that makes sense if that there is something beyond the world, the Lord Himself, that decrees it so. Because without a
Hmm.
God that says murder is wrong, then murder being wrong is only a matter of opinion. For example,
Yeah.
the Nazis said murdering Jews is good. Without God, well, so what? Like, how do you? What's the secular argument to say that murder is wrong? Because murder, like, what if you want something that person has? Just kill him, take it. It
Yeah.
benefits you. And also, if you're looking look at the natural law route, because the founding fathers and that kind of era of the Enlightenment, they focused on primarily the Lord Himself and also natural law. But some laws we can't really get from nature. For example, animals murder all the time. So the only reason, like, they also rape all the time.
Yeah.
So the only reason why those two behaviors are wrong is because our Creator commands it so. And I guess the final conclusion to that would be, well, it's not just enough that there has to be a moral law. There has to be justice, universal justice for it. Not in this world. There has to be something else because so many people live on long lives, even in spite of so much injustice that they do, so much suffering that they cause. that the only way for God to be good would be if, no matter who you are judged exactly as it needs to be once you pass on.
Mm. I think it's very interesting you're talking about a universal moral law, because I think it's actually written in the Bible that I'm not sure if this is quoting verbatim, but that in the distant future, instead of the laws of God, God will write his laws in our hearts. And I think it's interesting that even if you're not religious, nearly everyone can agree with the concept of, oh yeah, you should treat people as you want to be treated. You should just, like, not be an asshole. And, yeah, the Nazis thought murder was good. And as a result, they're, like, the most universally condemned party in world history. So there definitely is. It seems weird that even if you're not religious, you have, like, an innate sense of moral law. And I think that ties into your belief system that, okay, well, there's some universal constant moral law that we can't really explain then, because we don't really see that kind of behavior in animals nearly as much. So it's sort of like, I do agree that it seems weird that there would be nothing else out there. There seems to be stuff going on that we can't really explain. That's actually sort of the reason I got into religion in the first place. I mean, like, I do, like, chemistry and stuff like that, and I do science, but, like, there are obviously things that science can't explain, and there's obviously more out there. I'm just like, okay, well, science is cool, but I want to learn about that stuff too. And that's, how I got started in religion in the first place, actually.
Yeah, because there's so many questions that really science can't answer. Like, I think the biggest distinction is science can tell you how something works, but it can't tell you why something is or why something should be.
Yeah. I mean, all science is really the study of the laws of the universe.
Mm.
And so if God created the universe, then it's not really that outlandish to think that he's outside of it. So trying to explain God's workings with science is like, it's like putting gravy on Skittles. It doesn't work like that.
Well, I do think science and religion are, well, at least Judeo-Christian religion are very compatible in
Oh,
that
absolutely.
just the fact that we can understand how the world works doesn't mean that we're getting further away from God. I think the way that the science was developed early on through the earliest works is through the Catholic Church, actually,
Mm.
um, through theological and theological studies, um, and through that work, these scientists were these early scientists, the way they would put it is they're getting closer to God by understanding more about how his world works.
I miss that view of science so much. Because nowadays, science and religion are so at odds. I mean, you believe in evolution and they just shout Adam and Eve at you. And it's just like, I don't think that Adam and Eve was honestly meant to be interpreted literally.
No,
Fun
and
fact,
there's a lot of parts of the Bible that are supposed to be interpreted metaphorically. They go back and forth.
there's a parable in the Bible that warns against interpreting God's messages too literally. And that happened with King David when he
Mm.
murdered Uriah. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Uriah, like, to steal his wife.
Oh.
Yeah, that. And
Oof.
one of the priests came up to him and told him a story. Hey, this is a message from God. So there was this guy who only had one lamb, and he loved this lamb to death, and he let the lambs eat at his own table and drink from his own cup. And down the road there was a rich man who had, like, a whole flock and herd, and when he had guests, instead of killing from his own herd, he stole the lamb from the poor man and slaughtered it for dinner. And David got really angry. He said, how dare this person? He should pay back 4 lambs and be held responsible. And the prophet had to say, dude, that's you. That's you. You're the one who did that. So it's literally, even in the Bible, there's an example of somebody interpreting a story for the literal meaning, for the literal face value, and not for the meaning of it. So I think it's really important to. I really don't think the Adam and Eve story is completely literal. And I think that science and religion are completely compatible in this way. I don't really see why they have to be at odds all the time.
The metaphorical interpretation of Adam and Eve can go. An interesting thing about it, so Adam and Eve, they're in paradise, and I think it's a good way to interpret as humans before we really became aware. Because in the beginning, they're naked and they don't really feel anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second they eat from the tree, the knowledge of good and evil, they become aware of their vulnerabilities. And the first one to become aware of is their nakedness.
Mm-hmm.
And after being expelled from paradise, that's when, well, now that they're aware of all these things, that's when they can truly suffer. And that's when, Adam, he's cursed to toil the land for all his days, which that's all our lots. We do have to work from, once we're grown, we do work from day in, day out, so we can earn our keep and have our living. And
Yep.
also, Eve having to suffer through labor. That's another thing. Well, I guess humans, I would say, are more intensely aware of their own suffering after they became aware. And the first real kind of people are their kids, Cain and Abel. And they kind of exist in history. I think they're at the beginnings of kind of what, like, in Earth. I don't think that's exactly history yet. I think it's still metaphorical then. But it's still interesting how the first brothers, it's that's also where the first manifestation of real evil comes in. Cain chooses to do something vile. And that's something animals don't do that. They kind of just live on instinct. They hunt because that's what they do to survive. Whereas Cain, he knows there's something wrong about this action, yet he goes and does it. And I think that's where the line is, where he's like, before the Lord, he can't bear the weight of his own punishment. Like, that's roughly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you break that inner awareness of what's good and evil, when you actively choose something that's evil, I think I'm I'm pretty sure everyone knows that they did it, and it weighs on them heavily.
Yeah.
To varying extents based on what the thing was. But it can be repressed, but no matter how much you repress it, you still know. You're aware of what you did. And then real history doesn't really start to come in, I would say, until kind of Abraham. That's when it starts to feel more like you'll that's where the transition, I think, is into more history as we would understand it. And the literal and metaphorical interpretations of it, I think that's a major distinction between Islam and Judaism and Christianity. Dennis Prager points out how Islam, in its own language, means submit to God, versus Israel, meaning struggle with God. And also, another important part about Islam is they think that the Quran is perfect, that everything in that book is literally true as meant by God.
Hmm.
And that, therefore, well, it's, I guess I would rather struggle with God than have to submit to something else like that. It's more, it doesn't focus that much on the freedom, versus I think Judeo-Christian stuff, the whole emphasis of the reason why there's good and evil is because people are free. Free and aware, free to choose.
Yeah, that's an interesting interpretation. I'm not sure because honestly, I have such like a very delicate conscience right now that even if I do the slightest thing wrong, it weighs on me really heavily. And at times, I have this struggle where, well, if that's the case, I don't know if I really want to have free will if I'm going to end up hurting people. I mean, I guess that's partially due to low self-esteem, but I did think that what you said was really interesting about that. I don't think I'd be one who'd rather struggle with God on that respect. I think I'd be one, I just want to learn how to be a better person. I mean, the ideal circumstance for me, would be like to go through life only doing good things and like never causing any pain or hurting anyone. Obviously, I highly doubt that's going to happen, but I think it would be really good to have that as an end goal. But then there's the interpretation of, okay, well, what is hurting people exactly? Because then, okay, well, if someone's doing something wrong and you tell them and you point it out to them and you hurt their feelings, you're technically hurting them, but don't you think it would be worse if you let them continuing bad behavior? And there's a little bit of moral obscurity in that part that I personally really struggle with. So I guess I'm struggling in my own right, but I feel like I'm mostly struggling with myself.
And I guess that's how life is. It's always a struggle with yourself because it's not just, well, those questions that you have, but everyone has their own nature that we have to combat. That's one thing that I think the Bible does emphasize, and that there's a Jewish way to interpret it is you have kind of have two selves. You have kind of the way I would put it is you have your base nature, which is all the urges and passions, and then you have the good part of you, which you need to cultivate and strive to, because it's a lot harder to kind of put your passions aside for the sake of something as such as good and evil, for
Mm,
the sake of the good. And I think, well, what's more important is you do what is good, what is right by the God, and instead of necessarily caring about feelings too much, because I think the truth is a lot more important to kind of put out there. And if you spare someone hurt, then they're likely to not be aware of things that they could change or a path that is going to set them to a worse place, but because you don't want to call them out on it, they keep going down and down and down.
yeah.
And so I do think, I actually there's I forget where in the Bible is it, but there's one where it says the world will belong to the meek, and the meek, what it's supposed to mean, the literal translation would be those with swords and do not use them. As in, it wants people to be strong and capable and able to unleash a lot of hurt if necessary. But the reason why they're good is because they choose not to.
Mm. That's a really interesting concept. I mean, yeah, I totally agree that, it's a world that belongs to the meek thing. And I absolutely think that if you see someone going down a bad path, you need to correct them. One of the teachings of Jesus I really believed in is basically you should just love everybody and be nice to everybody. Nobody's going to want to be a better person. Nobody's going to want to put in the effort if they've been like abused their whole life. It's going to be a lot harder for them to be able to strive and say, I want to be good and I want to be better. A lot of people need the extra encouragement. For example, nobody's going to yell at you, and nobody's going to like make someone change their views by leaving an angry comment on the internet. It's like that's not really how that goes. That's not really how that goes. It's more of a concept of if you want to help somebody, you have to be nice to them, even if you don't necessarily agree with them. Because for one, for the few people who do go through abusive stuff and are gonna say, I don't want to be like that, and I want to be a better person. For anyone who had like, for example, abusive parents, and say, no, I don't want to be like them, and I want to be a better person for my children even if they didn't have any help from outside. I have an immense respect for those kinds of people. And I hope I can be more like them someday.
That I put good before I came to appreciate the teachings in the Bible. Turn the way I understood it was there's potential in everyone. There's potential in both ways. Be the best person that someone can be, and also be the most depraved person someone can. And that best is what it would look like if someone could live with passion every day of their life. If they can, everything they do, they put out the maximum effort that they could, and they enjoyed it. Like that, finding something where they can kind of achieve something like that, pull out their potential, And also the reason why I like that so much is that's that point where you see yourself growing and improving your own life and the lives of other people. When you get to that point and you see how far you've come, that's when people are happy. That's when they have meaning in their life. And I think that meaning is able to be there in spite of your material circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I came to back then is, well, one, I have to try to do that in my own life. And then to bring it out in others, I have to treat them as if I see that in them as well. Because the reason why I always loved talking to all the quiet people that even now, but all the way back then when I was from elementary to college, I always found them the most interesting. I always found the people that were quiet, no one really kind of reached out to have so much more, not 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 just to themselves that others didn't see, but that they themselves didn't see. And I would feel that just by reaching out a hand and being genuinely curious about what was inside that person. I could see, and also they could bring out so much more to them than they ever felt possible.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Usually the quiet people are the ones that don't have very much self-confidence, so they usually don't see that kinds of things in themselves like you do from an outside lens.
It's an act of trust, like, and supreme courage, because if you're willing to put all of yourself out there and exchange that and just put it out there to someone else, put out your hand, it oftentimes brings out it calls forth the best in them as well. It's almost like a challenge. It's like, I'm willing to put all my heart out right here, and I'm hoping you would do the same. And that's what I interpret what you said earlier about showing love to everyone, even the most vile people. Putting your best forward, hopefully, a lot of the time does call out the best in others too.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
it's a good thing to kind of, I think it's the ideal thing, if because I don't think school did that back then, and I don't think it's taught in many families. I think the best way to orient a society would be to teach people how to bring that out in their own lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really agree with what you said before. I mean, one of the things I've usually thought about, I've always considered people are like mirrors. And when you see those most vile people, as you said before, it's either likely because they were simply raised that way and in their head they believe it's all right because nobody corrected them, or it's because somebody was that way to them. Like most of the time that's what it is. And even though it's difficult, when you reach out to them and be good to them, a lot of times it catches them off guard and they feel compelled to show the good back, because it's just a matter of, okay, well, what everyone does what's justified in their own mind. And sometimes you can get put in a cage that way if you don't have as much experience with the outside world. So if you be that outside source and you show them what is good, it does have the power to change people, and a lot of the time it does.
And it's interesting. It's not that you yourself are the one that's changing them. No, is they see you, and then they decide to change themselves. They are the one who with the impetus upon that.
Mm.
Because one thing I've learned very early on was, you can't, no matter how hard you try, you can't change people. If you can't solve their problems, it's on them to do it. They have to see it. So I think that's why I thought the best thing to do was be an example. Because if maybe someone sees what that looks like, and you can convince them that they have that power too, that they'll use it.
As a Christian, I totally agree with you. And as a Christian, I've always considered like the number one example would like be Jesus. that he was like the example that God set before the world. And if more Christians set that example as well, showed what it is to be good, I actually think a lot more people would be religious nowadays, because a lot of times Christianity can be a lot of people are driven away by Christianity because there can be, some hypocrisy in the Christian faith and all that stuff. But I've always thought about it more about setting a good example for the world. And that's really hard to do because we're all human beings and we all make mistakes. But at the heart, I think each of us should try their best to be good.
People should. With my criticism of Christianity, that always been, I've always seen that the people that I meet who are Christians, they focus more on the belief rather than on the actions. So, for
Mm.
example, let's say, because Davis has a lot of Christian groups, and for some reason they always talk to me. I don't know, maybe it was God trying to give me a message. I don't know. Um, and always their focus would be on, well, since you don't believe, you're gonna go to hell. And I'm like, okay, bye. I don't like when that's up front, because, well, one, I have different views on um who goes to hell and such, but only slightly different. I think what's more important than the belief in God and all that is the actions, if you're acting according to his law. Like, for example, in early stories in the Torah, there are multiple people who aren't Hebrews or any of the forefathers who are God-fearing people. And that's what I would describe myself as. I think I'm a God-fearing man. I wouldn't describe myself as a Christian because, one, I haven't read the New Testament yet, so I don't have solid opinions on Christ yet. I know he's
Mm-hmm.
supposed to be the perfect man and other related stories, but I haven't delved too much to kind of have an opinion on that yet. And I don't do all the Torah. I don't do all the Jewish laws, so I can't call myself a Jew. I don't think. Um, and I'm kind of happy with the idea of being a God-fearing man, because, one, I think that's a lot more open to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Because, well, there's so much, I would say, negative press regarding Christianity and crazies. Because there
Mm-hmm.
are some crazies. You
There
meet
are a
them.
few, yes.
And I do think the main criticism for Christianity is, even though I don't think they mean it in the initial interpretations, the emphasis on belief over action. Because then it resulted, like, remember, indulgences. That's one big example. Or you convert at your deathbed and then you're saved. And those are things I disagree.
Yeah. I totally see where you're coming from. I think it's sort of a misinterpretation because, like, one of the core concepts of Christianity is you are saved by faith and not by works. But equally as important, faith without works is dead. And I think it's misinterpreted a lot. I mean, the main idea is you can be as good, you could be near perfect, but everyone's sinned before and everyone's fall short of the glory of God. So the only real way to get to heaven is for God to have mercy on you. And I sort of agree with that. But he's going to be less inclined to be merciful towards you, in my opinion, if you don't have those works to support you. I mean, he's a very loving, forgiving, merciful father. And I think the idea is you do works to show your gratitude. Because you're like, hey, I'm saved. I want to show my appreciation and follow all of his laws and try to be the best person I can be. And then you'll be saved in the end because you have your flaws, but you tried your best to be a good human being, and God will forgive you because of that. And I think eventually, slowly, more and more emphasis became on just faith, just faith, just faith. Your works can't save you. And I guess I sort of agree with that, but I don't think that means they're not important. Because I see a lot of Christians just throwing works out the window. And that's something I don't really agree with.
Or to just go to church and then live a non-godly life outside of it.
Yeah, that seems a little, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to judge other people.
See,
If
go on.
sorry, if they truly feel that they're trying to be a better person by just going to church and then living a normal life, that's fine with them. To each their own. Personally, I do think that we should put an effort to try to be better people every day. I think that's like the core concept. That would be how I would describe the quote unquote good works.
See, I think that the faith, the reason why faith is so emphasized is because I think the belief is that if you truly believe in the Lord with all your heart, your actions will follow.
Mm-hmm.
That if you truly loved him with all of your soul, then you would be acting out what he says. But since everyone is flawed, we make mistakes and we fail and we turn away from that. And that's why I think the actions are more supersede kind of the faith themselves, as in if you act in a way, like what's more important than believing is acting as if you do believe and praying towards that. And I think the idea of being saved, I don't think that's helpful because I think that takes the moral weight off of each individual. If you've already been saved by Christ and all you have to do is believe or have that faith, then the moral weight on you to be the person that you should be and disappears. He already died for your sins. You're okay.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think the proper interpretation should be not that you're not saved yet, but you kind of the goal is to be the person like Christ, the type of person who can take on the sins of the world just as he did.
Well, allow me to raise you one. You said that if it takes the moral weight off of you, that's not helpful. But why would you need moral weight to be a good person if you are like a truly good person?
Because everyone has a conscience, and I think everyone has a conscience because of the Lord, and that's why everyone at some level has some understanding of good and evil. They can feel it, and by listening to that, like Aristotle's a good example. Not Aristotle, Socrates. The way he described himself as why he was so smart, or why he thought he was smart, was he put it have a little voice inside of me, and I just do what it says, and that applies to how he died, in that everyone was trying to ostracize him because through his going around and asking people questions, he made everyone look like an idiot and everyone hated him because he stood by the truth. That's what he stood by the most. He always stood by the truth. So they tried to kill him, except not really. They were like, if you leave, we won't kill you, but if you stay for this amount of time, we will kill you. So he and his students went back and forth, deciding about his defense and all that. And one day he really stopped. He said, "I'm not going to leave. I'm just going to stay. I'm not going to defend myself. I'm going to say I did the right thing, and we'll see what happens." And the reason, and his students asked him, "Why are you doing this?" And he goes, "Well, a voice inside of me says that I should." And he accepts death even after living a long life, after sticking to his principles, and he takes it out with honor. And so I do think I don't think it's I don't think you can base a society around the idea of just everyone will naturally figure out how to be good. I do think you need the faith component out there because that's where you learn the values in the first place of what is good and evil. But I do think there are some individuals who they don't necessarily believe, but they live such a good life that is essentially along the line, like almost exactly on the lines of what is good and evil, that I don't see it as just for a good God to punish a man like that. I think the judgment bestowed upon the Lord at the end will be fair among everyone, non-believers and believers. He'll judge exactly along what is good and evil. And I think it's in the book of Revelations where it's like the judgment will be so perfect that every man and woman will think it's fair. They themselves, whatever they receive, it will be exactly what should be ordained.
Hmm.
So that's why I don't place as much of an emphasis on faith itself, more so understanding that these principles are important. That's why, God fearing man.
Hmm.
I just think it's too. I think it would be unjust for if it was just faith alone, or a majority of faith, in spite of the works, to kind of save you. I think that's just unfair.
Yeah, honestly, that's why I'm not sure I can completely describe myself as a Christian, because I completely understand the concept of, well, you're gonna get punished for what you did wrong, and God is so glorious that you've sinned and you always fall short of heaven, so you're only gonna be saved by faith. And I agree with the concept that none of us are perfect and we can't really get to that perfect state without God's help. But I also agree with the concept that it seems really unfair to say that everyone who doesn't believe in Jesus just goes to hell. That has always bugged me excessively. I mean, I've seen for example, people who are Muslims who still believe in all of the same, like nearly all of the same morals, and I see them acting it out. And I'm just like, I can't imagine these people going to hell. I just can't imagine that. It just doesn't seem like something God would do, honestly, at least to me. So I actually agree with you on that point, at least for now. I do think faith is definitely important, but what's the point if you don't have any works to show it, you know?
I do think that too, and I don't know. I think these values are sorely missing from the world around us.
Yeah.
I guess the way I think it, and I think it's the reason why it's happened. I don't think most Christians or Jews know how to defend their own religion or why it's a thing.
I mean,
That
yeah.
like you and I were figuring it out because well we chose to go and learn about it, read it, make our own thoughts about it. And our parents didn't show us these things. And I think that's true for most people except the part where they go and learn about it themselves.
Yeah.
And if you look at the messages of the culture, it's kind of the opposite idea, whereas it's almost a Rousseauian noble savage, where human nature on its own is good, and it's society itself that makes it evil, or makes evil things happen. So therefore, society should be dismantled. And kind of those were the thoughts that really bled into um, the French Revolution, putting equality first over liberty, and also that same idea of the noble savage kind of plays into how Marxism developed, whereas it's the evil capitalists against everyone else, oppressing everyone under them. Whereas versus, well, capitalism itself is a system based on freedom. Its core principle is that you are an owner. You are the owner of your own person, and therefore, whatever work you produce is yours, private property, and you since you own yourself, you are naturally free from coercion. That you have a right to not be accosted by someone else to go into a forced negotiation. And the system is based on people of their own free will choosing to negotiate with other people because they believe that interaction will benefit them. That's the core base principle of that. But then the noble savage idea is that everyone into Marxism, that everyone in the beginning they just shared everything. Everyone were to each of their what's the whole quote? To each their need, and
From each according to their ability to each according to their
yeah,
need.
okay, yeah, that, and also that also plays into romanticization of the indigenous peoples of North America, and that this place was extremely peaceful and never knew anything like war or such until the West arrived. Versus if you look at the archaeological evidence, it's not true that there's huge amounts of, how would you say, those mass burial sites? A big reason to that would be large wars, and like if you look at damages to the bones, it there it's kind of clear that this continent knew just as much strife as a past continent. But this romanticization of what human nature really is leads to people today justifying behaviors which you and I would consider obscene and not okay for everyday society. Because it's natural, it's their passions. Who are
Yeah.
who are you to judge them?
I mean, going back to what you said before, I think you said like a lot of people don't know how to defend their religion. I mean, a lot of times that people get to be raised in their religion, and part of the reason I think it's actually sort of dangerous to place such an emphasis on faith is because then they become immediately repulsed to asking any sort of questions, any sort of doubt, any sort of anything would be like thrown out the window. But some questions aren't necessarily bad. I mean, if you're doing something wrong, you should question that. Or maybe you should question, hey, maybe I got this bit wrong and I'd be a better person if I did this. So it's sort of a catch-22 with the faith thing, because I've also seen faith create some of the most beautiful versions of people I've ever seen. The people who think they're going to heaven no matter what, and yet they still put in the effort to put in good works and be a good person. Like, even though they don't have to, they do it anyway out of sheer joy. And I think those are some of the most beautiful people I've ever seen. So you see both like the dangerous bits of faith and both like the very helpful, very, very ideal bits of faith too. So I'm not sure exactly where I'm trying to go with this, to be honest.
There's also
I
a
think,
stigma on that. Well, if you're focused on the faith at all in the culture, you're like, oh, you're just some backwards, backwards religious believer.
if
You and your faith, pish posh.
I
But
mean,
you do
like,
recognize that, don't you?
yeah, I mean, like, here's the thing. That's actually one of the reasons I think, at least biblically in the New Testament, that Jesus had to come in the first place, because the rabbis placed so much emphasis on tradition, 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 that they were literally losing sight of actually using God's laws to be a good person. Like,
Mm.
people were getting, I think there was like a story in the Old Testament where people somebody was collecting firewood on the Sabbath and they got stoned to death.
Mm.
And people were using this like, okay, well, you can't even lift a finger to help someone on the Sabbath. Jesus literally tried to heal someone on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees began chastising him. And he started lecturing them. Are you kidding me? Even you guys lead donkeys to water on the Sabbath to let them drink, and you're going to tell me it's not okay to heal a person on the Sabbath? And it's sort of ironic that now I see traditional Christian values almost going towards the same way. I mean, in any case, and like any religion, if you go too far towards tradition, I think you lose sight of what's really important. But then the problem is they intertwine tradition with faith when they're not necessarily the same thing. And so that they sort of become repulsed when you try to fight any sort of tradition whatsoever.
Actually, there was emphasis back in just before the founding of our country. The idea was, what was it? It's before freedom of religion, because the idea more specifically is more like freedom of interpretation. That different sects of Christianity were okay. That as long they were all using the same Bible and using the same and using the same verses, they were all just coming with different interpretations. So the state should not have any say in crushing any group or prioritizing any one group over another, and allow that discourse between over what each verse really meant between the people. Because, well, there's a lot. for example, that a good stoning one would be, I think it's in Leviticus, but I think I'm also reasserted in Numbers, where if you have a rowdy child, they have to be the parents have to take, if they choose to take it to the child to the court of elders, and if the court of elders deem it so, then then the kid would be stoned. And of course, you can interpret that literally, or think about what that means in a broader context. And what that law does is ends the parent's ability to choose to kill their own child. They do not have that power over that soul. That was the interpretation that took hold within the Jewish community and within I think it's Talmud. That is their book of Jewish law. Because prior to that, parents, and also in other cultures, parents basically own their kid in all ways, and if they chose to, they could do such a thing without repercussions. And this is the first example of any culture removing that ability from the parents, and thus kind of forever. And if you believe in the Judeo-Christian moral law, this is interesting because that could be more broadly interpreted in "Thou shalt not murder," but I think it probably was necessary for it to be said more explicitly.
I mean, yeah. I mean, for so many years, children were treated as property. I mean, a lot of times people just had children just so they could work the fields and stuff like that. So I imagine that needed to be stated explicitly because it was probably a very, very progressive concept at the time.
Another progressive concept of the Bible is, well, eye for an eye. Like, you may think you may, like, people today like criticize it as, oh, that's an evil thing. Why would you take out someone's eye? Or it's just, that's barbarism. But I like the interpretation where that's the ultimate statement of human equality, in that it doesn't matter what status you are. A commoner's eye is just as valuable as a noble's eye or the king's eye. And the other thing with that, the other important one, is if you are wronged, you only, the punishment can only, it cannot exceed the wrong that was done to you. You can't go past that, because then it's, well, because that's not okay. It's worse.
Yeah. You know, I forget exactly. I don't know if this is in the Talmud for sure, but I think also the Jewish people don't obviously interpret that as literally pulling out someone's eye. It was more about paying dues. Like, if you hurt somebody, you need to pay them back somehow, and you need to make things right with them, no matter who they are. Usually that was done through like compensation or like a sum of money. I don't think they actually would pull out someone's eye, even in like the old times.
No. And the other thing is, well, because you never be able to recreate the exact same damage that they did to you.
Yeah.
The Bible definitely did. The reason why I gravitated to its ideas is not only that the ideas that I appreciated growing up and learned, I originally came from this, but the principles of the Bible are historic for when they came about. Some, like, historically. Um, what's a good one? I think one of my favorites is honor your parents. It's interesting how you're not commanded to love your parents.
That's true.
Because, well, I think it can be very hard to love your parents, and I think it's a good thing that it says to honor them rather than to love them. Because if you had a vile father, vile mother, there's no real way you can love them the way you would love a good mother, a good father,
And
especially if they did.
you shouldn't be held accountable for not being able to love them that way either. I mean, to say that somebody should be guilty for not loving to death somebody who's constantly abusing them, I don't feel is correct.
And the converse of that, it means as a parent, you should act honorably. Which a lot of parents should kind of aim for that a little bit more. Maybe.
Maybe.
But
Just maybe.
even if they don't, as your kid, as their kid, you really can live in a way to honor them, even if it's away from them.
Yeah.
That's one. I think that's another important thing. Another kind of revolutionary idea. Because I've been also studying Eastern philosophy, and it's a lot more rigid. It's a lot more submissive, I would say. Submissive to authority. And especially in one of those emphasized role is parent-child. Whereas the Bible doesn't really emphasize that. The only authority you really submit to all the time is the Lord and no one else. Because in understanding that everyone is flawed, you know that everyone can be abusing whatever authority that they do have. And if they are going against what is right, then you have a duty to stand up against it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of what you said is supported in the New Testament as well. That verse in particular brings to mind a quote where Jesus said, "If you love your father or your mother more than me, you are not worthy of receiving me." And how I always interpreted that is that if your parents are doing something morally wrong, you should stand against them, because if you're trying to be a good person and you're trying to be morally correct, that shows that you're loving God above your parents in a way. At least in like the symbolic term, because in the New Testament it says, if you're loving me, you're obeying my commandments. So I think, yeah, what you just said would definitely be supported, because if your parents are doing something wrong, I think it would be wrong to not point it out to them or stand against them. I mean, obviously, if your mother asks you to murder an innocent person, you shouldn't go through with that. That seems like a backwards thing to do. So, it's good that a lot of the Bible actually doesn't place that much emphasis on obeying your parents, unless when they're talking about specifically your father being God. But I see a lot of religious families being like really harsh and demanding with their children, saying, no, you need to obey us, you need to listen to us. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure where it comes from exactly.
Well, one thing that I learned recently is that the modern kind of thing today, where we kind of let our kids go, that to not live as parents, to not live for your kids, as in have your whole life defined by having your kids in the home, comes from white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
Huh.
That because other cultures, for example, Jews, Italians, Latinos, well, broadly, whatever Hispanic, Guatemalan, Mexican, anything like that. There's such a big emphasis on the whole family being together kind of all the time. You kind of don't let everyone leave. You're, as parents, do everything you can for your kids, and when they leave, you're kind of done. You prefer to have them in the house with you. And Asian families can be a lot like that too. But what the WASPs did, and influenced the rest of the United States to do more broadly, is you raise your kids as best as you can, and you send them out. But your life doesn't end there. You can continue on after that. And you're not responsible for your own kids' mistakes after a point. Like you did what you could raising them, and once they're gone, it's up to them and see how they fare, both faring in society and in following the moral law. And I think that's a good thing because one, at least in my own mind of how I would be as a parent, I sure as hell wouldn't let everything stop once my kids were gone. My life isn't over. And I think the more important thing would be to continue doing the thing I mentioned earlier, giving my all to earn the love of my wife at that point. It doesn't end there. And you still have your duties to follow.
I mean, yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, definitely raising kids would be like a massively important part of life, if not the most important. But I don't think that necessarily means your life have to end after your kids move out. I mean, you're still your own person. You can still contribute to the world even if your kids are gone.
And let's see, what was the other thing that I? Oh, and I guess another important thing of why it's good that the Bible going to say love your parents is that means as a parent, it's not important to act in a way so that you're loved by your kids. Because that's the common thing today. You want to be your kid's best friend. You want them to love you. And then kids end up becoming spoiled brats because you never say no.
Mm.
I guess a good example would be my dad. He doesn't tell me that directly, but I've been told by my uncle that he's thought about his view on that was he doesn't know if he's earned or deserves to be loved by me or my sister, but he sees us as being good people, and he sees that as that was his job, and he got it done. So that's what he's proud of. And well, he was it. I would say now I do love him very much, but growing up, I definitely hated him so many years out of the 18. It wasn't easy, but because he was the person he was, I'm the man that I am now, and I have the values that I have, and the opportunities I do have too. So I do think I would much prefer that over, let's say, him not providing that yet acting in a way so that I love him more.
I mean, I can tell you and I obviously had very, very different experiences growing up. My mother spoiled me rotten. Like I have a whole room of toys that I don't know if I ever played with most of them, and I'm working on giving them away. My mother was always so very nice to me because my grandmother passed away and then my father passed away too. It's like she felt obliged to be the kindness in my life. And you know, I'm not gonna lie to you, I've actually been called a spoiled brat before, but I'd like to think that I'm at least working my hardest to be a good person. Above all, what my mom taught me is that she taught me how important it is to respect your children and like to love them and to like be that example. And I get what you're saying about, oh, well, you don't want to be your child's best friend because you always have to worry about them loving you. But it's almost like a biological instinct for most kids to love their parents. I would think so. I mean, as they get older, obviously, if they have different opinions than their parents and different opinions keep getting forced on them, they're going to be repelled to that. But, and I totally see what you're saying, but in order for a child to like really, really hate their parents, I think that's actually sort of difficult to do, to be honest. And I'd be very interested in what kind of experiences you had growing up. And I'm glad it worked out really well for you. But I also think that hating your parents in that way has the potential to go really wrong. Just like spoiling your children has the potential to go really, really wrong. So it's sort of like we were both at two opposite extremes and somehow it turned out well. But I think the best case scenario is to have a balance between the two.
I think a good way to put it will have your ideally you want both parents and one to be the judge and one to be the kind of the caretaker. One to
Mm-hmm.
push your limits and kind of set the rules, and one to kind of pick you up when you fall.
I agree with that, actually. You know, until my dad passed away, I always thought that my mom was the one who usually set the rules, and my dad was the one who would usually be like the big soft boy. Like I would be a daddy's girl, but then once my dad passed away, I started getting a lot closer to my mom. And I think she like really stopped disciplining me. I don't know exactly when she stopped, but I think she knew that at that point I already had like basic moral values drilled into me, and it was more important to be like a loving and supportive mother at that point than someone who pushes my limits. That's what I needed at that time.
It's every parent's call, and parenting is one thing that no amount of reading books or hearing about it will prepare you for it. Like, okay. I guess my feeling of it. So, I already expounded a little bit earlier on what the idea of love is between husband and wife. And I think it, it's almost as powerful. I think it might be more powerful. I'm not sure which one is more powerful. But the special thing about them is that you see not just you, but the person you love most in their eyes. And everything that they do, you see both of you together in that little thing. And it's up to you to kind of prepare that little ball of whatever it is to face the world at large. And there's so many instincts that flare up there. Of the first one probably would be to protect it and provide for it at all costs. Others would be curiosity, what type of person is in there, because I think every person has their own nature on top of the human nature. And I do think those two, spouse and children, those are the most powerful motivators in life. And you won't know really how you react to it until you're there. You can think about it, you can kind of mess with it in your head, but when it happens, it's going to hit you like nothing else. And I
Man,
do think it's something worth having.
sort of crazy that you and I don't really. I mean, I don't know how your romantic life is going, Stephen, but I haven't really experienced anything close to that yet. My mother's the person I love most in this world, and she's always been the motivator. Like one of my entire reasons for going to college is that, well, my mother's been struggling financially, and I want to be able to pay her back for all she's done for me. So I sort of do you understand that motivate of like, okay, I have to help and I have to protect at all costs. So I guess I sort of understand, but also I sort of don't because the type of love is different. But I believe the baseline love, like what love is in its essence, even though you have different types, I feel like I understand what you're saying at that point.
I think the baseline is it's the way you describe it because it's very the base of it is very similar feeling to no matter what it is you love. I think it's that thing, whatever it is, truly becomes a part of you. And in what it is, whenever you're around it, you can feel it, and it's a very strong feeling. So at the core, it's kind of it's more powerful, I would say, in certain activities or it's with certain people. But the things that you love are things that are the closest to who you are. That's what I felt growing up. And to that thing of what you're describing, the providing, I think that's the natural thing you learn when you want to become or have to become responsible for more than just yourself. And that's part of why I think love love in both kid and spouse kind of sense is very important is so different. It is as you for a lot of people, it's some of the first times that they do have to become responsible for not just their own needs, but of someone else. Other kids, they experience it early on because they have to do it for their siblings, or the harder option is for their own parents. And I definitely have friends like that. And I do think that's one of the experiences where people grow and mature very quickly once they have to think beyond themselves.
Yeah, I agree.
I think we're a little bit over an hour. So what would you say is the most important value, Judeo-Christian value you'd want to emphasize? All the viewers out there.
Love everyone.
So we'll end it here, and we'll see everyone in the next one.